Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Bernt-Santy, and I have brand new, never before heard on the podcast guest today. Her name is Helen Frazier. Hi, Helen.
Hi, Heather. So thrilled to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Um, so just before I throw it over to you to talk more about yourself, I think did you share this article with me? Is that how I discovered this article you wrote for Chalkbeat? So we're going to talk about this article you wrote, and thank you for sending to me because it was really timely on many levels. But that's really all I know about you is that you're a person in early childhood who wrote this article. So what do you want folks to know?
I am a pre-K teacher working in Brooklyn. I've been working in early care and education since about 1998, and I've worked a lot in Head Start, early Head Start, and then also worked as a coach and system builder in New York State for a while. So I'm kind of familiar with both the system building side and the practice side. And I also teach at Bank Street. I teach assessment, approaches to early childhood assessment, and we have a big focus on social justice and assessment in that course, which
Mhm.
is really important to me. So during the pandemic, I was really eager to be back in a human community.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
and like for some sensory life. And
Hmm.
so I decided to, leave the state system building work and go back into the classroom. And it has been such a joyful experience to just kind
Yeah.
of come back with a different mindset and really be able to explore some of those things that, we were talking about, social justice and learning stories and all the things that I was beginning to learn more about and
Uh-huh.
wanted to actually explore and practice.
Yeah, I'm reading a book right now called I don't have it. It's called Whole Child Literacy. It's like brand new from Exchange.
Oh,
Stacy, I
yeah.
think Benge, Benge wrote it.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking last night, like this, I miss being in the classroom so much because I'm reading all this stuff and I can go talk to my students in the college classes about it. But man, I wish I was in a direct care where I could be, implementing and plugging this in with real children and seeing how that goes. But also I just generally miss being with real children
Yeah, it is
most
so
of the
great.
time. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So thank you for sharing that. The article that you wrote is called In Preschool, One Size Doesn't Fit All. So why is New York City asking early educators to use a single curriculum? And it was so this is from Chalkbeat, the website Chalkbeat, and was that the original place of publication then was chalkbeat.org. Okay, so if
Yes.
people want to find this, I want to make sure I'm giving them the right information. So before we do a quote and have the real conversation, before we share a quote and go wherever, and while we're still sort of on topic, would you talk a little bit about why this article, what made you want to write it, and what were you hoping would happen with it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, working in Head Start, even in 2002, 2000, around that time, I had used creative curriculum and teaching strategies, which
Yeah, me
now,
too.
and everybody that I talked to says, "Oh yeah, I know that I had the little book," or
Uh-huh.
even like I use the little book to teach my college courses because
Yeah.
it, is a helpful way, or we use the progressions to reflect on children's development. And then I um, left Head Start for a little bit and came back in around 2014 and used it again, and I was like, "What happened?"
Yeah.
It's very different, and it is just that's when it was kind of in the beginning of being owned by private equity,
Yeah. See,
and
I
it
didn't realize that had happened. Like I knew there were
yeah,
changes, and just from listening to my students who work in programs that use it, I was like, wait, this doesn't sound like the stuff I used not that long ago. And then I read this and I was like, oh, private equity, that explains a lot.
yeah, it does explain a lot, and you know, uh, at that time, it was like, oh, it's all about data collection now, like to just
Hmm.
such a huge degree, like to, it's beyond just like using this as a helpful tool to reflect on individual children's development. And now it's like we're just entering so much data, like more than we could possibly do at work,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's so much of educators' time was spent entering this data, and directors were kind of transformed to these like middle managers.
Hmm.
And I went to Head Start conference, and they referred to teachers as line workers, and I was like, that was
Did they really?
yes. I was like, that was not my plan for life. Like, I love being a teacher. I have no intention of being a line worker.
Oh, wow.
But it feels like that,
Yeah.
like where you're just kind of like processing according to this norm. And there's more facilitation guidance, more scripts, more, you know, so kind of
Mm.
detailed management and control and surveillance. And then I also noticed that like the other Head Starts, like especially family childcare networks, they were just like hiring somebody to create fake data for TSG, just
Oh,
the,
no.
the
Of
compliance.
course they would. Of
Yes, they
course.
were trying
Yeah.
to protect their grants and
Mhm.
like whatever other funders they had, like, Robin Hood or whoever
Yeah.
else was funding them was saying, well, you've got to create this much improvement or else we're going to not fund you.
Uh-huh.
But they were like, okay, like, what are we going to do to serve our neighborhood? So it was
Wow.
an ethical decision on their part in one way.
Yeah.
But I was like, this has gone, really in a strange direction. So when and then we were in the pandemic and we were all on Zoom talking
Yeah.
about like reimagining early childhood with equity at the core and trying to think about anti-racist issues. I thought we were going back to this like more multilingual, like more like personal experience. So I was shocked, like
Ah.
completely shocked by this change.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And so once I read a couple things in this piece you wrote, things that students had said in class were like washing back over me. I was like, oh, that's why they said whatever, they can't do this or they can't do that. Um, and they all talk about they use, will we use gold, and gold just has you entering stuff all the time. I was like, oh, surely you're exaggerating, but no, it doesn't sound like they were. Wow. And so the article you I mean, in the title, it's and because you're from New York, this was written specifically in the context of some legislation or some policy that had come down to sort of standardize what was happening for early childhood programs and children in those programs in the state, or
In
just
the
in
city,
the
in the
city of
city. Yeah.
New York City. Yeah, okay. But I think that while that's very interesting, and New York listeners will have their ears perking up for that, it's also really relevant to the field. There just is, as we get more conversation about fear about learning loss and pressure for school readiness, and start talking about universal pre-K and those kinds of things, that that pushes us further into the direction of standardization attempts, and really figuring out how we can make everybody the same. So for our quote for the rest of the conversation, late in the article, kind of, you just said there's more to consider about a young child than their skills. Not everything that we value can be measured. So I'll just ask you to speak to that for a second, and then we can see where it takes us.
Yeah, so at my school we have forest school. So it's not a forest, it's a park in the city. Mostly like
Yeah.
a dog run, but we sit, it was just the spring, the sun was shining, the kids, I'm sitting on the grass and the kids, like a group of kids started sitting around me, right? And
Uh-huh.
and they're like enjoying the grass and the sunshine, and they decide spontaneously to start telling stories, and they're just like telling stories and the other kids are just listening, and this is like the end of the pre-K year.
Uh-huh.
I'm not really facilitating anything, I'm just sitting with them. And then this little boy who had just like his family had been going through a bit of a rough patch, and he just said, I want to tell a story. So it's like, okay. And he starts to tell his story, and I mean, the story was really scary. I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this is like a lot, maybe I should say something, maybe I should interrupt, but the kids are just looking at him with their big eyes.
Yeah.
And then he finishes his story, and this little girl just, there's like this pause. This little girl just looks at him and says, I'm sorry your story is sad.
Oh.
And it was like, oh my gosh, it was such an amazing response, and
Mhm.
like so intelligent and so attuned
Mhm.
and so far beyond like my intelligence and my emotional intelligence, where I'm like, "Da, da, 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 what should I say,
Yeah.
And I just think, in many moments throughout the day, like the children are like more intelligent than us.
Mm.
They have skills that don't fit on a continuum.
Mhm.
They have abilities that, like, if we fail to recognize that or just reduce it to like, this is your rating for what exactly oral language,
Mhm. Yeah.
then we've like missed like the real heart of what's happening. So I've been like so grateful to have the opportunity to really explore learning stories and see how they can be really transformational
Mhm.
to the classroom.
Yeah. It's so it's so interesting to me that that like just hearing that kind of a story wouldn't be enough to change people's minds to say, "Oh, you're right. That was a powerful moment." And if we needed to, we can connect all kinds of learning to that, and we can use the language of standards to discuss what's happening in that. But just for that child in that group in the moment, that was powerful, and we deserve that. Um, but in real life practice, then we distrust it, right? The global we, not you and me, of course, but and policymakers never get close enough to that kind of a moment. um and that's a real problem. It's a real barrier.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to what you were saying, like distrust, like
Mhm.
that we don't trust educators and children to just be human together. And I think we need to just do whatever we can to preserve that humanity right
Yeah.
now. And if I had had a script and been like, now we're studying balls, like that would never have happened. Like
Right.
there was no planning that went into that other than go to the park.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
um
like how much
uh,
more learning could happen?
uh-huh. Yeah. And when we think of, like, when I hear that story, I think about, the current buzzwordiness of social emotional learning and the controversy around it, and the push to buy kits for social emotional learning. And I think that little girl in her response had it. Like that
Really?
was emotional and social skill and development. And but it's harder to measure, right? Because we don't know when those moments are going to happen. And if we're required to measure things, we have to set up inauthentic situations and hope we see it.
Yeah, I mean, you could contrast that to, teaching strategies now has this plugin called Hatch that'll like collect 50% of your objectives. So it's an app instead of observations, because it was
Uh-huh.
taking teachers too much time to write observations, as we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
So now you could just do it on an app, right? Like identify the happy face, identify the sad face. And
Yeah.
that's like, I mean, if you compare that as an assessment of children's like social emotional skills versus like
Right.
a real like empathy, actual empathy and understanding and caring about another child, it's just scary to me like where that could be headed.
Yeah. Like, I wonder if I think about, I'm always trying to put things into an adult context to help sort of foster some understanding or conversation. And I'm thinking now, if I was doing a job interview and I had valuable social skills that I hoped my employees had, showing them something like that and saying, well, point at the happy, worker and point at the angry worker and what do you think this man is feeling, with a picture of, whatever employee's face. We would think that was ridiculous. We would think, I hope we would think that's ridiculous. We would think that doesn't tell us anything we really need to know about this person's skill. But it's that measurement piece, right? That measurement piece messes everything up.
It really does. And I think I think this idea that like we're going to find some way to measure children's approaches to learning meaningfully, like it's a fool's errand. Like
Right.
it's not measurable. Just let it not be measurable, but also recognize that it is the most valuable part of what we're doing in early childhood. And I just think the lack of, whether it's the state or the system builders or, the private equity firm, whoever it is, like it's too scary for us, for them to let educators have that power, I think.
Right. Yeah, power is a big piece of it too.
Yes.
So excuse me. So I want to hit on the standardization part for a little bit. Because it's one of my pet peeves, this idea that we think it's an appropriate, an achievable goal to have every child in this group of children, and not just in this group in front of me, but like every child at every center in the country or whatever is going to have these same skills if we just give them the right input. And that having all those standardized people is somehow going to make our world a better place. When in reality, that's just not achievable, regardless of what tests say or what our curriculum packages promise. That's just not achievable. But there aren't many people just standing up and saying, this doesn't make sense. Your goal it doesn't make sense.
It definitely doesn't make sense. And I'm so fortunate to work with So Young Park at Bank Street, who, has really developed this framework for social justice in education, and, really combining the ideas around universal design for learning and culturally sustaining pedagogy, because it's like we want plurality, right? Like we want to like maintain the beauty of the plurality of our communities.
Yeah.
And so when we do assessment, we have to really think about assessment that's done with the children and with the families and not on them. Like it's not a healthy way to be in relationship to rate people.
Right. So thinking about it, man.
That's not the foundation of a healthy start to a relationship, because then I'm in this like false position of fake objectivity in relationship to you, and I have this power dynamic over you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I'm teaching an intro to early childhood class this 8-week term. And so I met with them this morning, and we're talking about developmentally appropriate practice. We're accredited through NACE's higher ed. So, we have to use some of that stuff. And we're talking about the 3 core considerations, which in a nutshell are, what do we know typically about this age and how they develop and what they need? And then the next question is, okay, so then what do we know specifically about the individuals in front of us? So here's what we know about groups of 3-year-olds. Here's what I know about these 3-year-olds in front of me. And then what do we know about the social and cultural contexts that they come to us from, or that we're all living in? And I think about how impossible that is to teach at a college level or to do any kind of staff training with, because if you don't have real children and families in front of you, you can't answer that. You can't say, yes, this is developmentally appropriate, or no, it's not. Just based on a scenario in a textbook or whatever. And I think we give so much lip service to individuality, both developmentally speaking, and then the kind of pluralism and diversity that you were just talking about. But in the end, it's like we're only willing to think about your individuality to see how far you are from the standard.
Yeah.
We're only willing to look at your social or cultural context to see how it doesn't fit our norm. And as long as we can bring you into the standard using those two pieces of information, we'll look at those two pieces of information. But we don't really want it. We want the standard.
Right. I really appreciate, the revision of the DAP statement and the idea that these norms that we have are just based on this one Western,
Right.
monolithic, heteronormative and
Mhm.
white idea about development. So it's like we're just bringing people closer to this norm that's really, not culturally sustaining in any way.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
for you thinking about my own children, I think it's so sad to think about them all having the same experience. And,
Yeah.
I would hate to be like, you're going to go out and have the standard pre-K experience. You're going to have these conversations and do these
Mhm.
things instead of having, their own particular experiences in their own
Yeah.
particular communities.
Yeah. This is sort of an oversimplification of that idea, but so I have friends and our children are not all the same age, but I have friends with similar, age ranges of children, whatever. We lived in the same parts of town, so they all went to the same schools. And we always laugh when we get our Christmas tree stuff out because we have so many of the same ornaments, because when our child went through the class with that teacher at that age, they all made the same thing. But also we can look at them, because all of our kids are kind of weirdos. We can look at them and see, okay, but here's how my child made their individual mark on this. So that's not really going anywhere except as an example that despite efforts to do the same thing all the time for everyone, that difference is going to manifest. It's going to show itself. And so then our jobs as professionals become either, well, how do I squash it so that we can get back to the standard? Or what do I do about this standard so that I can appreciate, celebrate, accept this individual difference? And it's a hard spot to be in.
It is, and I'm worried, I guess, about programs being under pressure, to make kids all be that, above widely held, exceeding widely held expectations. I was in a program where outside of every classroom they hung a graph of the amount of children that were exceeding expectations, meeting expectations, or below expectations, even for the infant toddlers.
I was like, how old are they doing this for? Infants and toddlers meeting or exceeding expectations.
But of course, the ones that are below expectations are, the children with disabilities, but rather than, appreciating them for their individual strength,
Mm-hmm.
that's the only thing they're seeing about them is below expectations, and like, how far are you moving that bar graph? And why do we want a 2-year-old to exceed what 2-year-olds do? Like, let them be 2.
So here's,
Why is that a
right,
goal?
right. But so also there's this idea for me then that a 2-year-old who's exceeding expectations is still a typical 2-year-old, because we know there's this wide variation. Like there's not necessarily anything special or positive or, getting a head start or whatever, because they're on this end of the developmental spectrum for a 2-year-old, and somebody else, they're still typical 2-year-olds if we would be honest about it.
Right.
If we could take off those cultural blinders that color everything we see about children. Like part of it too is like, if there's no, some are doing well and some aren't doing well, then how do I measure myself as a teacher? And we know that's an official side effect or use of standardization and tests and checklists, but there's also that internal dialogue or monologue about, okay, so if I'm not measuring and there's no better or worse, I'm lost. Like as a teacher, I'm lost.
Yeah, and I think that that is such a, that's such a cultural mindset that's so
Yeah.
deeply ingrained, and that was part of the work that I was hoping we could do, is work ourselves out of that mindset through stories, that we
Yeah.
can really begin to understand, like, what is so brilliant about that 2-year-old that's so exciting that they are doing, that's making you, see that they're exceeding expectations. But
Yeah.
what actually is it? Because the family can then remember that, and with joy,
Hmm.
and wherever that child is, they can
Hmm.
think of these moments with joy because they love that particular little human. But when you see a human reduced to numbers and graphs, at that age, it's really tragic. I think
It is.
it's tragic, as on a human level.
Yeah. And it's not going to do much. I guess that specific example of the graphs outside the classroom, but just in general, thinking about how we feel like we need to assess everything and only the things that can be measured are the important, are going to be seen as important. That's really going to get in the way of, for a lot of people, an authentic relationship with the child, but also with the family.
Mm,
Right? We're putting up with the child. It's going to impede relationship building because we always see them as this thing that I need to be fixed, or they're going to measure my teaching skill based on whether I can get this child from this standard to the next one. But when we're talking with families, if all we're focused on is, are they ahead or are they behind? Um, how can that be a partnership?
yeah. And I think that, like, one of the gifts of being a teacher, and going back to teaching again after a break, is like, I feel like I have more to offer families, and I realize, like, I can see what an incredibly vulnerable time this is in their lives. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is their baby and they're presenting it to the community, and then the community is going to, what are you going to think of my baby? And you have to
Yeah.
hold that moment with such, respect and gentleness and intentionality,
Yeah.
and not with a graph that says they're below expectations, and this is what we're doing to improve them.
Yeah.
Obviously, if children have a right to access to services, and we should, support families in that, but
Mm-hmm.
I think this goes
Right.
far beyond that,
Right.
and those
Yeah.
in
And
the
we
mindset.
I'm
Yeah.
glad you bring that in, because of course we're um uh not saying that, yeah, we shouldn't measure anything,
Mhm.
because there are those moments when families and children would benefit from, you know speech language pathologist, or medical
Mhm.
referral, or something like that. um those are just two things. I'm not saying those are the only two things that matter, but um what sorry, I thought I had something that I wanted to ask you about, and then you kept being smart, and I got distracted. You just kept saying smart things, and I forgot what I was talking about. Um, so I feel like we've talked a lot about the things that are frustrating and hard, and maybe not in line with really developmentally informed practices with young children. Where do you find hope? Where do you see hope? How do you practice hopeful practices in that kind of a system?
Um, well, I think you have to find, I mean, I find hope because, I'm in a place where I can do learning stories and have, really try to think about think what a better way would look like.
Yeah.
And so that feels great. And I feel great in that, finding a community of advocates. I've been working with a group in New York City called People's Early Childhood, and just imagining with them. I feel like with you, like, it's important to have, like, I feel hope when I listen to your podcast.
Oh,
Like,
thanks. That's
I'm
nice.
not
Okay.
alone.
Yes, exactly. That's really why I started it. That's the whole reason I started the podcast, was so people would talk to me about things like this.
Yeah, like, it makes
Yeah.
me feel so much less alone, like, when you're talking to people about, like, that really it's about love, and, like, people are
Hmm.
scared of saying that what we're doing is love. I think that is exactly what I think is just, people used to be like, we're scared to say play. I think now we're
Yeah.
scared to say love, and I
Right.
think we need to keep talking about love, and how that's what we're we're doing here, and
Yeah.
it's okay to pay us for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Just throw in a pitch here for Carol Garbode Murray and Jules
Yes,
Page's work on
exactly.
professional love. Just to get them involved. I have to bring Carol's name onto every podcast. That's a law. Yeah, when I think about, I've been in situations where, so before I was where I am now, I was at a preschool that was part of a speech language and hearing department at the university here. Before that, I was in teaching 1-year-olds at a chain center, that's nationwide. There wasn't a lot I could do, or I would have moments where, when I was in that chain center, where the lesson plans were coming down from a corporate office hundreds and hundreds of miles away from me, and were just recycled, year after year. It was really hard to feel like I had any agency to, maybe tweak things that I felt like weren't developmentally responsive, or even just didn't fit my play philosophy. Um, and it was really difficult. At the speech language preschool, there was a lot more leeway to follow children and see what they were telling me they needed and hear their brilliance. But in that, I remember the stress of being in a program where you feel like, well, this is the curriculum we have to use. This is the data we have to collect. We don't really know what happens with the data. I think you mentioned that in the article too. And that just, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if that's the way so many people in the field are feeling right now, it's no wonder we have this staffing shortage. I mean, in addition to the low pay, feeling like you didn't have that kind of control, or like you weren't trusted to use your expertise and your experience and your knowledge. So I guess I'm just saying that so that, you know, I feel like sometimes people are probably listening and going, yeah, but I can't do anything else. So where I'll go with that is, then you can still kind of find those ways to be as appropriate as you can within an inappropriate system, if that makes sense. And even in the one setting that was so stressful, that dictating only really applied to 2 hours in the morning. So I still had full day, full afternoon, and a little bit of time before I was expected to implement that, where I could have more freedom. So realizing that you have the whole day for the whole child, and that part that is scripted and you don't have as much control over is a smaller portion of the day for a lot of us. Again, probably not for everybody, but that was helpful for me to think about what I could change or kind of make more in line with what I was comfortable with, what the children were telling me they were comfortable with.
Yeah, I've definitely been in those situations too. And I think that what you're saying about agency is so important. Like,
Yeah.
just find those moments to practice agency, and find the things that you can meaningfully resist, because
Yeah.
there's a big case for resistance out there. There's lots of people who are resisting,
Mm-hmm.
and both within private equity, which targets industries with low-income workers and extracts the money out of them and
Mm-hmm.
reduces quality and reduces wages. So, people that are working in private equity owned childcare, or working with private equity owned tools, you can organize about private equity and what
Mm-hmm.
it's doing to the economy as a whole. And I know it's like another job on top of your job, but sometimes it can give you energy to know that you're not alone. And there's
Mm-hmm.
like people in all different industries, medical industries and nursing care industries, who are experiencing the same thing that we're experiencing in terms
Mm-hmm.
of scripting and control and doing things that we think are not best for children.
Yeah. And I think we're at a really, I know I've said this before on the show, I think we're at a really interesting time where we have an opportunity to really change things for children and the people who are working with children post COVID. with the staffing shortage that we're experiencing as a field, because honestly, it's harder to get fired. So if you're just trying to let children play more, or you're trying to offer activities that are a little bit more in line with the children you see in front of you, that's not, they know no one's waiting for your job.
Yes, that is so true
So
and so important.
I'm not saying go and tell them Heather said you can do whatever. Maybe I'm saying that, but uh to, you know, not that I hope you go out and get fired, but I don't know. I feel like you know, let's think about the Reggio Emilia moment, Regia Amelia, how, whichever one it is, they both sound wrong now. Moment in the history of our field. It was a country that had sort of been through, I mean, not sort of, been through something really devastating. And it was time to rebuild. Not just the system was broken, the buildings were gone, literally time to rebuild. And they had that moment where they thought, what's important to us in this community? The children and their education, and not in like a, I believe the children are our future, sing-songy, we'll say that but not do anything about it way that we get into. But they really just decided this is our value as a community, and they created something that was in line with those values because of, you know, the bad stuff that had happened, and forced them to change. And I think, you know, our buildings didn't get knocked down. We're not living in bombed out communities, thank goodness. But COVID was a bad thing. It had a negative impact on the world, our country, our practices, our children. And now we're seeing this, you know, nobody wants to work in the field anymore. We've got all these shortages for a variety of reasons. So why not take some time and say, okay, what do we really value? And if we really value that, what would it look like? And those of us in those jobs just started doing it that way. I think we could be having a very different conversation if that was happening.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that like teachers' creativity in that, like their opportunity to be
Yeah.
creative, and like create for their community, and like the artistic part of being a teacher, right? Like that you're going to create a beautiful learning environment that comes from you and your ideas. I think it's so important for people to have that agency and feel like they built something and they made something that was really theirs. And I'm, you know, there's this National Academies, it's funded by Gates. It's called like a new vision for high quality pre-K.
Mm-hmm.
They're like doing a project with like a lot of experts about like trying to create a high quality pre-K. And I'm so nerdy that I listen to the listening sessions. So
Nice. Yeah.
I'm going like full nerdy, but
Excellent.
there were like two things that they said that were so alarming to me, which one of them was that like access to scripted curriculum is an equity issue. And I was like, hold up, because
I need more information.
all the people with money that I know go to Reggio and
Mhm.
Forest School and
Uh-huh.
Waldorf and Montessori. None of them send their kids to programs with scripted curricula.
Right.
And then the other thing that one of
Wow.
the people in the listening session said was, if a 2-year-old is going to have 4 different teachers a year, we need to prepare for that by having a scripted curricula, because
Ugh.
the turnover is so high, we can replace the teachers with a
Mhm.
script. And you can't, no, it's relationship
Yeah.
based. It's about that actual attachment. You cannot, like, this is not going to work. You cannot replace the teachers with a script. You just have to pay people more.
Right. Right. Yeah,
Like,
I
no,
mean, I've
it's
thought
just-
about that too, because when I talk about like theme planning and why we shouldn't do that anymore, even then the answer is, well, if we have these prepackaged themes, whether it's curriculum we've bought or just the teacher the year before had all these things packaged up and ready to go, then it doesn't matter who comes into the classroom. It doesn't matter. We don't have to put that much effort into keeping our staff, because whoever comes in can take that box and follow the directions. And that's not skilled teaching. That's not, you know, that's not, you know, informed by how children actually learn and develop and what's important for them to to be learning and developing at that age or whatever. It's just it surprises me. So many of us are doing the work. There are so many people in the United States right now working with children birth to 5 that if we had some sort of, uprising, we could have a lot more power than we do. Maybe I'm talking about a union. I don't know. But it just seems like even with outside of that kind of formal organization, if the people who talk about believing in play and relationship and sort of child-led, I'll say programming for lack of a better word, just started doing it, what's the worst that could happen?
Right.
It's an opportunity that I think is out there.
I definitely think so. And I think it's not, I think it's doctors and people in nursing homes, like across industries, people are just saying like, we just need to do what's best according to what we know for the people that we care for. So like as people who work in care,
Yeah.
I think we need to think about connecting with other industries so that we can form, if not a union, a coalition to stand up for what we believe in, because this idea that we're going to make it more efficient and, more app-based, because all the evidence-based things are actually
Right. Yeah.
apps.
Yeah. Don't get me started on evidence-based.
It's not going to work for, this generation, and they deserve our defense.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's tricky. I wish there was an easy answer, but I think honestly, this is not just me trying to be a more skilled wrapper-upper of podcasts, but what you've written about in this article is a step, like, right? This is a consideration we have to make, and people need to have the information and the skill to say, here's why I'm not comfortable. You might have an instinct, but now we can read the stuff in this article and be like, okay, so here's some real data. You want to talk about data? Here's some real data about what's happening and what scripted curriculums are effective for and what they're ineffective for. Like, it's out there. We can find it.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope that more people will just, like, if we all just continue to share our practices when we're doing something that we feel like is meaningful, like in spaces we've created, then, hopefully we can keep building in that direction. I just think, I love the way you've put together so many people who believe similar.
Yeah, I know.
Are heading in this direction. It's really helpful.
Yeah, I love my nerds. That's for sure. Okay, so I just want to say again, the name of this article is "In Preschool, One Size Doesn't Fit All. So why is New York City asking early educators to use a single curriculum?" from chalkbeat.org. And thank you for it. It's, I wouldn't have come across it probably if you hadn't sent it. So I thank you for sending it to me, but I'm just for having it out there, for putting it out there. I think that's really important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything you hoped you would be able to talk about or wanted to say?
I wanted to, I just, Leah Leone wrote that Inch by Inch book, and the inchworm, and they can measure the beak, or they can measure the legs or the tail of the different birds. But then the nightingale asked, I think it's the nightingale asked them, "Can you measure my song?" And then he inches out of there. And can't measure our song, right?
That's like, perfect.
Let's just inch our way out of here. And
yes, it's so good. I hadn't thought about that book in a long time.
It's a great book.
No, I'm gonna have to dig it out. Yeah, thank you. That's a great way to wrap this up. So thank you again for being on, Helen. And for the writing that you did here and the work that you're doing. I think it's important, and glad you're out there doing it.
Sure.
And thanks everybody for listening to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd.